asset recovery.
Yes.
Literally as the op.
Yes. He provides policy advice to countries on anti-money laundering, combating financing of terrorism. Starting to move to letting you guys speak. But he was also the director of investigations for Deloitte, worked as a prosecutor at the AMIL, CFT, and organized crime at the Tribunal of Paris, and has experience as a government auditor, and an investigative judge. Finally, Richard Gordon, friend of ASU. Richard is a globally recognized leading expert in the field of financial integrity, and he's also the faculty director for Thunderbird School of Global Management, Master of Leadership and Management Financial Integrity, MLMFI degree program. Before that, as a senior staff member of the IMF, Richard took the principal lead in designing, developing, and implementing the fund and the World Bank's policies in AML-CFT following the attacks of 9/11. He served on the managing director Select Task Force on terrorism finance, and was the principal author of reports to the fund's board of executive directors advising that AML-CFT can be made part of the IMF's mandate. He was also the main drafter of the first methodology for assessing compliance with Financial Action Task Force recommendations on money laundering, the FATF 40, the world standard for holding countries accountable. So, please tell us a little bit about your work and also how you're seeing progress in the field of fighting corruption and in upholding financial integrity. I'll start with Valentina. I'll actually Richard's here.
It's glad to be here. Good morning, everybody. Hope everything is well with you today. Hope you're having a good day. If you're looking forward to hearing about corruption, and I will speak from the French point of view, and from a particular angle. I am here in the US as a Marshall Memorial Fellow. It's a leadership program that is organized, that was launched in 1982 by the German Marshall Fund. So what I'm interested in is the transatlantic dialogue, and the transatlantic dialogue in the fight against corruption in particular. That's what I'd like to talk to you about today, how France and the United States went from antagonism, I should say, to cooperation. It's a relatively long story, but the beginning of the new relationship, the relationship started in 2006 when France adopted the anti-corruption law. It was actually published on December 9th of 2006, and as you probably know, very soon it is UN International Anti-Corruption Day, and that it will be celebrated here.
As it should. On December, the Friday before the actual day.
Okay.
We're going to be holding a panel and an event.
So in France, it was decided to publish the new law, the anti-corruption law, that day to mark the event and the strong commitment of France to fight against corruption. And the reason why it is called the Sapin II Act, the Loi Sapin II, is that the principal author of this new piece of legislation is Michel Sapin, who was back in 2006 Minister of Economy and Finance, and has been in politics for a very long time, and I had the pleasure of teaching with him at Sciences Po. This law, the one that was adopted in 2016, is known as the French anti-corruption law, but it is much broader than that. Let's remember that in 2016, France was towards the end of the term of President Hollande. New elections would be in the spring of 2017. And so end of 2016 was an opportunity to include in a broad piece of legislation many different things, including the fight against corruption. But in France, when we refer to this law, to the Loi Sapin II, everybody thinks that it is the anti-corruption law. And this is what really made France and the US start having a good conversation, a good dialogue in the fight against corruption. But there is a question I always ask, it is a bit provocative, probably simple, but not too much. When we think about an anti-corruption law, we might instinctively say, okay, the anti-corruption law was adopted in 2016. Does it mean that prior to that in France it was legal or possible or ethical or whatever you want to pay bribes? And the answer, of course, is no. So question, what has changed? Why an anti-corruption law if bribery was already in the French Penal Code as it was prior to 2016? There are two things that were introduced into the French legal system in 2016. The first one was an obligation for actors in the public as well as in the private sector to prevent, detect, and deter corruption. And to comply with this new obligation, this prevention obligation, companies in France, companies of a certain size, have the obligation to design and to implement a compliance program, what we call an anti-corruption program. Article 17 of the Sapin II Act lists what the ingredients are, what the components are of a compliance program. The compliance program is now mandatory for companies. A code of conduct, which is a document in which you set the rules, what can be done, what cannot be done, and then a whistleblowing system, who a whistleblower is and what kind of protection you give to whistleblowers, knowing that in Europe there was a directive in 2009, a European directive that was transposed into national legislation by every European country, including France, and that strengthened the protection that is given to whistleblowers, and they created a common ground of protection for whistleblowers in the entire European Union, which is the only thing, if I have to be honest, that is related to anti-corruption and that has been done so far at the European level. The European Union is not particularly active in the fight against corruption and considers that under the umbrella of the rule of law, but not per se as anti-corruption. But this is a totally different story, which we'll talk about another day. Another ingredient of the French compliance program is the mapping of risks of corruption, which means to identify in the company and in its activities where are the windows and the doors that can open to corruption, that can make corruption become a part of the day-to-day life of the company. Then due diligence on third parties, you've got to determine to which risks of corruption exposes you the fact of doing business with a certain third party. It can be a service provider, it can be a law firm, it can be a consulting firm, etc., etc. You have to determine the risks in order to then determine what kind of measure to put in place to reduce, to mitigate, to manage the risk. And then in your anti-corruption program, you have to create an accounting control system. You have to train people. If you want people to know what they need to do and what corruption is, you've got to train them. You need to determine what the consequences are if there is a breach of the rules of your anti-corruption program, and you need to constantly monitor and assess your program so that it always responds to the risk that exists in the company and mitigates them. So this is the anti-corruption program, the first new thing that was introduced by the law in 2016. Companies have to create, it's not an option, it is mandatory. They have to create this anti-corruption program, which takes time and can be very expensive because, as I said, it's quite complex. There are 8 different ingredients to it. So first thing, and this impressed somehow the United States to know that in France, companies had an obligation to create an anti-corruption program, an obligation to pay attention to prevent, as I said, prevent, detect, and deter corruption. And the second big thing that was introduced by the law of 2016 is the French version of the Deferred Prosecution Agreement. In France, we call it Convention Judiciaire d'Intérêt Public, CJIP. I could loosely translate in English as a judicial agreement in the public interest. Again, very similar to the Deferred Prosecution Agreement, dismissal of charges if the defendant accepts to fulfill certain requirements. And the result of this agreement between the prosecutor and the company is a fine that doesn't count towards the criminal history of the defendant. So it is very advantageous to a company to sign a French Deferred Prosecution Agreement instead of waiting years and years for the decision of a legal proceeding. So when I talk about the French DPA, and Andrea heard this yesterday, but I will use the metaphor again because I think it is quite effective, and how this was extremely instrumental in the dialogue, in the strengthening of the dialogue between France and the United States. I always use this metaphor. Think about the word table. In French and in English, you spell the word exactly the same way, Table. Jean-Pierre would pronounce the word table. Richard would say table. But when they come across that, but no, it doesn't work with my metaphor. It's not so. So when they come across the word table, they have an immediate understanding of what that is, and they know that they can sit at the table, they can eat at the table, they can have a dialogue, they can communicate around the table. And this is the message that France sent to the United States back in 2016. We are using an instrument that is very similar to what you have. We are speaking the same language. And with this instrument, with this table, which is not exactly the same because tables have different shapes, size, colors, design, but we get what you're doing, and we can sit around that table and speak the same language and have a dialogue. And this is what created this paradigm shift in which France and the United States were in a relationship of antagonism, I should say, in which France thought that the United States was applying the US anti-corruption law, the FCPA, in an aggressive extraterritorial way. And in fact, many French companies were fined by the Department of Justice, oftentimes as a result of deferred prosecution agreements. And at the same time, the US thought that France was not doing much to fight corruption, which was confirmed by the OECD. In 2012 and 2014, it said, France, you are not doing what it needs. You are not complying with the obligations under the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. After 2016, cooperation, we speak the same language, the United States realized that France was taking extremely seriously its obligations to fight against corruption and was asking even companies to contribute to the fight against corruption. And so the relationship radically changed. It became a relationship of trust. The pinnacle of it was the cooperation in the resolution of a huge corruption case, the Airbus corruption case, in which 3 DPAs were signed, one in France, one in the US, and one in the UK. And the country that took the lead in the coordination of the investigation and also got the golden share of a huge fine of 3.6 billion euros, $3.9 billion, went to France, around 2 billion euros, because there is a system of crediting when 3 countries work together in the resolution of a case. And so now, one minute and I'll be done. Now there is trust between the 2 countries. And what France needs to do is to continue putting efforts in the fight against corruption and avoiding 2 extreme actions. One is a lack of action, to not do anything, and the opposite would be to change too fast and radically the system, which would create confusion. So the good message is that there is now dialogue, but France should continue in its commitment to the fight against corruption to keep that dialogue going. Thank you.
Thank you, Valérie.
Couple of those days.
Yeah. Okay. So I have prepared some targeted, I call them targeted remarks on corruption and money laundering in France. So I'm going to try to put what Valentina just described, this reform of 2016, maybe in a broader perspective, and at the same time try to complement what can be said on fighting corruption, because fighting corruption can be also done by developing anti-money laundering legislation and practices. And that's also an extremely important element in France and in the world. And try to put that into perspective. Okay. So the first thing is, what is corruption in France? If we are speaking about France, what is corruption? You know that in the world there is a huge, a hugely important international convention that is called the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And this is the main instrument in the world to try to make countries engage in the fight against corruption. So for this convention, the corruption means bribery, active and passive, but it means also different crimes like embezzlement, abuse of functions, trading in influence, money laundering, and even obstruction to justice. So it's a little bit a broader view of the world corruption. For the OECD convention that you mentioned, of course, it means essentially bribery and specifically bribery of foreign officials and some offenses that are linked to this crime. So in France, when we are talking about corruption, it's a little bit different than in the US or in what we call in France the Anglo-Saxon world. Corruption means bribery in France, generally. But of course, the other offenses that are mentioned in the OECD and the UNCAC Convention, like embezzlement and exist in France. It is called abus de biens sociaux, détournement de biens publics, diversion of public goods, and all these things. Okay. And then you have the offense of money laundering, which is linked to corruption, because, as you know, money laundering, which means using and investing and concealing the proceeds of the crimes that you have committed, as corruption as a possible predicate offense. So when you are prosecuting the laundering of the proceeds of a bribe, for example, or the proceeds of a company, of what a company has earned through corruption, you are still fighting corruption. So I think it is important to have that into perspective. And I am continuing, and I have only six slides as notes. So we are going to go through that relatively easily. I just wanted to continue to put the French corruption into perspective, to have a typologies, a short typology of corruption in France. And here, what is important in France and what was important and led to the reforms that you have mentioned is three types of corruption. The first was bribery in government contracts, and specifically bribery in local government contracts. This was, and I fear that it is still relatively current in France, this type of corruption. And we had, it didn't start in 2016, it started in 1990, actually, when the first big scandal in France led to the first reforms. Reforms made by the same person, by the way. Valentina was talking about the Sapin law of 2016, but there was a first Sapin law, believe it or not, in 1993. which proves that Sapin was very involved in fighting corruption. Contrary, if I can make things lively, contrary to some of his colleagues from the socialist governing party, which, on the contrary, were kind of involved in corruption itself. Because, no, but it's not even a polemic in France. I mean, it's just history now, you know, because actually it was found by investigators that the governing party, the Socialist Party, was funding its political campaigns by corruption in the local government contracts. It worked very simply, you know, it was a very simple but very well-oiled mechanism that was organized at the national level. Think about what would happen in the US if you could have a corruption system at the national level, a country of 320 million inhabitants. Here in France, it was at the level of a full country of 50 million inhabitants. And what happened was that, of course, the local governments where the leaders were close to the Socialist Party would award contracts in exchange of in exchange shell companies that were close to the same party would send false invoices to the companies that obtained the contracts. The invoices were paid, and then based on that, the money in the shell companies could be used to fund the political activities. So I have mentioned one political party, which was, it happens, Sapin's party, but in the 90s, basically, all investigations that were then opened and continued showed that all political parties were doing the same. So we could mention a lot of other political parties, including the Communist Party at the time, but also the parties coming more from the right. And this is where, in 1993, the first reform, and that is also extremely important in policy, created the specialized units, police and prosecution and investigative magistrates specialized units to try to boost investigations. So that was this is a first phase of French typology of corruption. Second phase was, I don't know what's happening here, but okay. So I don't know why my paper. Okay. So the second phase, I'm going to go very quickly on that. It will be very complex to explain. Is bribery in construction and commercial real estate. Think about a system of administrative authorization to build Walmarts, Giants, and in the US. And this system was also a huge source of corruption because bribes were paid to obtain the authorizations, which means that the landscapes in France now are a little bit wasted because you have so many Carrefour, which are the equivalent of Giants and others. So, and third thing, and that is more relevant to what Valentina described, is bribery of foreign officials, of course. But when she said was corruption legal or not before 2016, actually there is a doubt. To be honest with you, if you take a more historic perspective, yes, it was legal. It was not only tolerated by the system, but somewhat encouraged until the ratification of the OECD Convention against bribery in international contracts in 2000. the system was that the huge industrial firm, generally industrial French firms, would pay bribes to foreign officials in various countries to obtain contracts. They would go to the, and it was not an offense. It was not a criminal offense, indeed. It was a criminal offense in the US since the 70s, after the Watergate, which was a huge boost to American reforms. But in France, the trend was a little bit delayed, and it was not illegal to bribe a foreign official. So it became illegal after the ratification of the convention in 2000. But the system was that it's very interesting to, I think, for students to have it in perspective. The system was that the firms would pay the bribes, put them in their accounting, and they will go, but it was not an offense in terms of corruption. But, of course, you can think that it is an offense in terms of embezzlement, because you are using the money of the company to do something that is paying people for things that are not really linked to business. And so they would go, and that would be also a tax fraud, actually, because you reduce the taxes that the company owes. So to cover yourself against this legal risk, you would go to the Ministry of Finance in France and obtain a sort of absolution. You say that in English? Yeah, exactly. An absolution from, you will give the list of the bribes that you have paid for foreign countries, of course, and obtain what they call the sort of quitus, absolution, quitus. We are a lot in the Latin. I'm sorry.
And tax deduction.
And it was tax deductible. Yeah. Okay. So you see, when you say was it legal or not? Yes, for a period, bribery was legal. So the reforms. You have mentioned the 2016. I have mentioned the 1993 and. Little by little, the creation of investigative units and also the creation of a money laundering offense, by the way, which was also used to prosecute corruption, as I said, in 1990, but that is 1994. And so, for example, you can have. Did I? Tell me. So my okay. Corruption. What I want to say, I can say it very quickly because it's a full reasoning from now after the perspective, is that you can fight corruption by implementing what Valentina just described, the 2016 law, the settlements, etc. But I was saying that still it remains that corruption is extremely complex to detect. So if you want to go to the level where authorities can punish corruption, the problem is that the detection is not necessarily there, and it is complex. And this is why, and this was my message, using money laundering legislation is another way of detecting this corruption, these bribery practices, and so what will happen is that you have corruption as a predicate offense of money laundering, and of course you are going to be able to go after, to prosecute the fact that the bribes, for example, are transformed are transferred, are concealed in Swiss bank accounts, and so this would be money laundering. And France added, and I think it's 2013, this one, another point, which is that you can create a presumption of corruption. And that is legally a very interesting thing to study, is that you have now a provision in the criminal code that says that when you are prosecuting a money laundering case, the assets or the revenues that are the proceeds of that you are suspecting of being the proceeds of the crimes are going to be presumed to be the direct or indirect proceeds of corruption whenever the legal material and financial methods of the concealment or conversion of assets seem to have no other justification than concealing their origin. So basically, it means that now you reverse the burden of proof in these cases, and this is the defendant who has to prove that he is not committing money laundering of corruption. So that's something that I found interesting to, this is Article 324, point 2 of the criminal code. Thank you.
We're going to move on to Richard, but before then, we have somebody big. I feel like a TV presenter, like surprise guest. We have Emil Vancados Dominguez, a friend, old friend of mine. When we were your age, we were working in The Hague as very junior lawyers, who is now head of global financial integrity at World Bank. So Emil has no pressure to speak, but can maybe answer questions. Richard, please.
So I'm going to take a slightly different tack and ask you to think traditionally, as I say, outside of the box, since you're all law students. And I'm going to go back in history long before you were born, when I was a law student. And I was approached by a justice of the Indian Supreme Court, later Chief Justice of the Indian Supreme Court, to ask if I would participate in a research project to create a free legal aid program in India. And it was called the Committee on Implementation of Free Legal Aid Schemes, because in India at that time everything was a scheme. So how I had the connection, I happened to speak a couple of South Asian languages at the time as an undergrad. But why would you go to an American law student to go to an Indian village or two and to interview everybody with what problems do you have to see what a free legal aid scheme would do? Now you can imagine you go there, and which I wound up doing with a couple of colleagues, and went to every single family in this one village and asked them the question, what are your problems? And you can imagine what the answer is. I've got so many problems you wouldn't believe. And they go on and on, and you take notes. But the reason when it came to an American, well, in addition to the fact that my classmate's father was Chief Justice of India, which kind of helps in the connection solve, is that I didn't have caste and I didn't have religion. So much easier to go and interview people. They won't identify, say, subcaste and they're the same subcaste. No, not possible. So we did this and discovered that probably the biggest problem, definitely the biggest problem everybody had, was a kind of corruption that was not something that I kind of learned in law school. The corruption was that big landowners were constantly taking over the land of smaller landowners or of the village commonwealths. And then you would call the police, and the police would come in and they would kick your derriere because they were not getting bribes, but they had the same caste affiliations of the wealthy folks in the village. Now there's this one weird example, because I have an entire caste. So they weren't getting money for this. It's just my caste subcaste brother usually is the person who's stealing your land. So I'm gonna take you and put you in jail, and they'll prosecute you for some made-up offense. There was an odd, wealthy, untouchable caste grouping where the situation was reversed. So they actually were the lower caste untouchables who were stealing land from the upper class, and you get a cop who was part of their subcaste and strange. But one of the things they told us is that it was an interesting kind of corruption because it wasn't people getting paid spiritually, but not in tech. So what do you do about this? So he spoke to the deputy commissioner, and he said, "Oh, it's corrupt. I can't do anything about this." He actually said, "I'm thinking about killing myself. I'm a complete failure." So what did we do? We suggested that, well, maybe there's something that you can fight this kind of corruption outside of the formal criminal justice system. What do? The civil justice system. You sue when somebody starts moving in their, stealing your land, moving your irrigation ditch. You go to court and you sue in the civil justice system. You've just taken the whole police, everybody out of it. And we'll provide free lawyers, and we did set up this free legal aid program, it's still going today. And it actually sort of worked. So how do you deal with corruption? Do you call the police? Do you get the justice department? No, you sue in civil court. So fast forward, I graduated, do a few other things, I go back to teach, and get involved with something called the Harvard Institute for International Development. It no longer exists. It turned out to be a racketeer influence and corrupt organization. Wonderful stories about that. They included former presidents of Harvard University. So there I was sent supposedly as a tax expert to help improve tax administration. A similar problem for this. Okay, so I won't say what country, begins with an I and ends with an A, and it's not India. And the same problem, which is we cannot rely on law enforcement to do anything about the massive tax evasions. Primarily, not uniquely, but the biggest loss of revenue coming from the president's family that owns most of the businesses, along with some other people in this very large country, largest Muslim majority country in the world. I won't tell you which one it is. And again, so what do? Well, the head of the tax, and actually later became finance, the head of the tax department. What do? Well, one of the things you can do is to try to mobilize, like we did in India, try to mobilize the private sector going through civil process. Well, it doesn't really work. But it would work with the tax department. Now, they couldn't bring criminal cases. Nobody was going to bring a criminal case against the president's family unless you had some sort of self-destructive tendency. So what they started to do, we will use civil cases. Now, in both India and this other big country in Asia, the civil courts were not completely honest either, and very, very slow in getting anything done. Constant adjournments, judges overwhelmed with cases. But just bringing people into court, actually forcing them to come in and defend against these civil cases, was so embarrassing. It was publicized, right? That even if there wasn't a judgment, it was something. It could actually try to move some distance toward reducing the amount of tax pay. So in one of the many errors, the IMF decided to hire me for the legal department, and absolutely the IMF wanted nothing to do with anything that had to do with the criminal justice system. We are a bunch of economists. We have this small legal department. We don't really know what they do. They say no about things every now and again, but all of a sudden we get dragged into this major anti-corruption issue in Kenya. So it turned out that the amount of money that the fund was lending to Kenya to cover its deficit, was slightly smaller than the amount of money that the president's family was stealing. That was. So the fund said, "Oh, this is not a criminal justice system issue. We're not taking on criminal justice issues. But we're not gonna lend money so that that can just be stolen. It would kind of be like proceeds of crime, your money laundering. So they sent someone from the African department there who was Japanese and said, you guys are gonna have to prosecute these members of the president's family and their friends to stop this corruption, or we're gonna stop funding. So the criminal justice system at that time, not particularly efficient or honest, wasn't the judge who did it, but the prosecutor basically dropped the case. And so the gentleman from the African department said, if on public TV, and they said, if you don't prosecute and get this money back, we're going to cut off funding. So what happened is the judge found that person in contempt of court, saying, you can't do that. I mean, and we're going to lock you up. And then he said, you can't do that because I have a diplomatic immunity. It wasn't really diplomatic, it was kind of. And so I was told to call him and with a message, oh, we can waive your immunity, you know. So he said, I'm getting out of Japan. I'm getting out of Kenya. So they sent me. And the idea was to create an anti-corruption authority. Knew nothing about this topic whatsoever. What do I know about anti-corruption authority? But it did turn, and eventually we did actually create an anti-corruption authority that resulted in a hit being put out on me by the vice president and my being smuggled out of the country in the middle of the night, which was very funny. But again, so what do you do? How do you create an effective anti-corruption authority when you have a government? And I apologize to the previous president because he treated me very well, not the vice president. How do you do that when the whole criminal justice system is corrupt because they're reporting to the president? Really? And it was again turned to the president. So anyone who thought they were losing funds through corruption, which pretty much was focused on the central bank. Right? So the central bank came up with various reasons as to why the skimming of funds by the president's family was adversely affecting the central bank. It took us a couple of days to come up with an argument for this. They went and hired a private law firm, and the private law firm sued under the tort of conversion, saying that money had been converted from the bank by these corrupt people in the president's family, and they won. They actually won. They got the judgment executed. Interestingly, that for those of you who are interested in comparative law, you mentioned Anglo-Saxons. So, go back way back in time, in late 19th, early 20th century, the British government put together a law reform commission for the colonies, not for England. Well, Scotland has its own law. They were killed in court. And they created basically a standard civil code and a standard criminal code, which was then enacted throughout the empire, but not in England and Wales. And so I actually having done this time in India, they had the same civil law as Kenya did. So I was already kind of an expert in Kenyan civil law. So I was actually able to work with this law and get a pre-judgment attachment, which we have in the US, but they still don't have in England. They have something called a Moreva injunction, which is something. But so they had pre-judgment attachment, and no one ever used it. And I said, I know we did this I know, yeah, because I was a volunteer lawyer there. We've used this in India before. Why don't you use it here in Kenya? I'm sorry, yes. Why don't you use it here? And they did. And they got pre-judgment attachment, and they had it executed, and they actually seemed pretty cool. So then I continued with the IMF, and the then Secretary of the Treasury, who was an old person friend of mine, wrote a letter to the fund and the bank saying, you guys need to get involved in anti-money laundering. And And of course, again, the defendant said, we don't want to do that. It has to do with criminal justice stuff. Turn to UN Office on Drugs and Crime. But I got them sort of interested, I should say, the Executive Board of Management, by saying, well, there might be non-criminal justice ways you can deal with some of the anti-money laundering issues, particularly with respect to tax evasion. And they cared about that. So, wow, we definitely need revenues to pay off the loans that we make to country. But they said absolutely not. And then 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden they were all in because terrorism financing was linked to anti-money laundering for good reasons. But again, how do you deal, and this is, I think, what you both were talking about, it's difficult to enforce any kind of criminal justice issue.
I'm just going to say thank you all so much. I want to have time for other questions. But one of the things that Valentina said yesterday at Georgetown was that it's about the leader. Like if you have a leadership, when we started with discussions about the United States, the DOJ, and about France, if you have a rule of law system that's based there and is at the top is functioning, although there's corruption, there will be a sort of light that's shown on this and can clear it out. The issue rises in countries like that, and is civil litigation enough when you think of places like Cambodia and even Ukraine, where how far, what is the proper way of dealing with that. But please, everybody, anybody who has any questions, also online, we're able to go through the chat with any questions. Ivan, please.
I think Richard touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to know, how did you start to get involved in fighting corruption, and what's something that you know now that you wish you knew then?
Okay, I can start on that. Actually, I was in the prosecuting team that prosecuted the case that I described to you, the 1990 case. So then I was the prosecutor, and I continued on the same topic for almost 30 years now. So that was my job, actually. But it's true that when I became a member of the French judiciary, I was not necessarily interested in corruption cases or in financial crime. But the fact is that when you see a case, it becomes and you get involved in it, it becomes something that you want to continue, because it becomes very lively, very interesting, and also very important, because you understand how much actually the citizens of a country lose to corruption. When you have this situation where all the contracts in a local government are awarded in exchange of bribes, in the end, you could calculate that between 5 and 10% of the taxpayer money went just to inflate the contract by 5 or 10%. And when you see that, it gives you an incentive to continue digging on the issue. Yeah.
My story is a bit different. It will tell you that we've been extremely technical today, in particular, Jean-Pierre and I. It will tell you that life is not only about rules and extremely technical things. Some years ago, a client of my firm needed someone to help them create their compliance program, the one that became mandatory in 2016. I had a good knowledge of anti-corruption, but I was not an expert back then, and still now I'm uncomfortable with the word expert. And I spoke with their director of audit. She was the one in charge of the anti-corruption team. And I said to her, I work a lot on compliance, anti-corruption, I know, but I've never really designed or implemented an anti-corruption program. So she thought that I was the right person to do that because I had zero expertise in really designing and creating, not just an intellectual understanding of it. And this is how I developed a passion for the topic. And what I wish I had known back then, or what I know now, and that I had just a kind of a light understanding of it, or first understanding of it, is that the law is not just an instrument to structure life in a society, but it can also be an instrument for foreign relations. And this is what happened with the 2016 law in France. It was not just about France internally, French companies, the French judiciary body, but it really became an instrument for dialogue between two countries.
I think I just kind of got
Yeah,
forced
yeah.
into it, but you probably already know this, looking into your own hearts and the hearts of your friends. There are people in the world who want to get bad guys, and there are people in the world who want to be bad guys. And then there are the vast majority that are kind of indifferent. I grew up in Massachusetts, where often one sibling becomes the mafioso and the other one heads the FBI going after them. It's very Massachusettsy, but it just, and you get that feeling that you want to get bad guys, but never getting the good guys. And when I first met Emile many years ago on a mission to Rwanda, and an issue came up that judgment tells me I will not go into it, but I realized very quickly that Emile was somebody who really wanted to get the bad guys, but did not want to get the good guys. And we became buddies who worked together ever since. So there you go.
Hey, Emile, please chime in, because you and I started as the most junior there. Who went?
This is not so much from personal experience, but more judging what is happening globally. And if you see where efforts are directed, it's interesting to note, which is, I think, the role and the focus on the role that facilitators, professionals, financial institutions play in either moving funds elsewhere or otherwise structuring a corrupt scheme. Whereas for a long time we have been only focused on the politically exposed person and his family and his entourage. I think there is more understanding now and more interest in seeing what we can do about the banks and the lawyers and the accountants. So interesting, for instance, in the 1MDB case in Malaysia, that they really went after Goldman Sachs. They have much deeper pockets. They have much more to lose. They do not necessarily need to be sued, in the global south. They can be sued here in America or somewhere else. Those are huge advantages, and I think we're only now starting to think through, hang on, they are much more vulnerable there. And the moment that you have a few big cases like that, that might change much more than, focusing on people who, to a large extent, will remain untouchable, even if you can get their assets somewhere else. Likelihood that they have enough in their own countries is such that, yes, if they take away a bit, but it won't really change the dial. But if you go after those facilitators who are much more exposed and can be sued in courts all around the world, that is slightly making a difference. And I think that's an interesting trend in this space.
And just add something. It seems to me that one thing that should be said is that you need to mobilize people against corruption, because it is something like a little bit an invisible crime in the daily life. Unless you are a victim of corruption, or someone is trying to get a right from you for something, or unless you see a huge case that is a scandal. And so mobilization of people, like me, you, and mobilization for corruption policies very often follows or depends on outrage. from people when they discover how they have been fooled by a part of the government or a part of the leaders that were supposed to represent them. So I think, and the reforms, by the way, there is, if I come back to the 2016 reform, you explained it a little bit like France wanted to advance and things like that, but actually it was also the follow-up of another scandal, which was the Cahuzac scandal, where, believe it or not, the Minister of Budget of France started a political campaign to fight tax fraud and cross-border tax evasion. And then he was very unlucky because journalists and the media found out that actually he had himself a bank account in Switzerland that he could not explain, that he tried to deny that he had it for 3 months. And that was the Minister of Budget. So, of course, there was a huge outrage in France, and the government decided we have to do a new Sapin reform. so, yeah.
Any other questions here? Emily, do we have any online?
It doesn't look like it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're here for a little bit, so if anybody wants to ask personally any questions or advice, career advice, feel free. But thank you all so much.